My name is Jenny Liu, and I'm writing this from my mother's kitchen in Seattle, where I'm finally learning to cook the traditional Chinese dishes I spent 15 years refusing to eat after white classmates in second grade called my lunch gross. Held their noses when I opened my lunchbox filled with my mother's lovingly prepared dumplings and fried rice, and made me feel so ashamed of my cultural heritage that I begged her to pack me Wonder Bread sandwiches with processed cheese instead. Throwing away the traditional meals, she woke up early to prepare and crying when I smelled the ginger, garlic, and soy sauce aromas that filled our home. At 29, I'm trying to reverse the cultural erasure that began in an elementary school cafeteria when I learned that being Chinese was something shameful, that my mother's cooking was disgusting, and that survival in American schools required rejecting everything that made me different from my white peers who ate PB&J sandwiches, Lunchables, and goldfish crackers that were considered normal, while my ethnic food was treated as evidence of my foreignness and otherness. The food shaming began on my first day of second grade at Lincoln Elementary in a predominantly white Seattle suburb, where my parents had moved believing that good schools would provide opportunities for their American-born daughter. I was excited to share the lunch my mother had prepared: steamed pork dumplings, stir-fried bok choy with garlic, and white rice in a traditional bento-style container that kept everything fresh and separated. I had grown up eating these foods and thought they were delicious, normal, and something to be proud of because my mother was an excellent cook who had learned traditional techniques from her grandmother in Guangzhou. The rejection was immediate and brutal when I opened my lunchbox at the cafeteria table, and the white girl sitting next to me visibly recoiled, holding their noses and making exaggerated gagging sounds. "EW, what is that?" one girl named Madison asked loudly enough that other tables turned to look. "It smells so weird," another girl chimed in, scooting her chair away from me as if my food was contaminated. Within minutes, I had become the girl with the gross lunch, and the social damage was done before I had even taken a single bite. The teacher intervention made it worse rather than better because Mrs. Anderson, my well-meaning white teacher, came over to address the situation and suggested that perhaps I could eat my lunch somewhere else if it was bothering other students, essentially validating the bullying by agreeing that my ethnic food was a problem requiring accommodation. She didn't tell the white students to stop being cruel or educate them about cultural diversity. She told me, the victim of their racism, to hide my difference rather than challenging them to accept it. The lunchbox dumping became my ritual throughout second grade, as I would take my mother's carefully prepared lunch to school, hide in a bathroom stall during lunch period, and throw the entire meal in the trash before anyone could see or smell it. I would return home hungry, but tell my mother I had eaten everything, and it was delicious, watching her face light up with pride while I felt crushing shame and guilt about the deception. The discarded lunches represented not just wasted food, but my rejection of my mother's love, her culture, and the heritage she was trying to pass down to me through these traditional meals. The Wonder Bread campaign began when I finally broke down and begged my mother to pack me normal lunches like the other kids: plain sandwiches with American cheese, Capri Sun juice boxes, potato chips, and packaged cookies that came from boxes rather than being homemade. My mother's face showed such hurt and confusion because she took pride in her cooking and couldn't understand why her daughter suddenly wanted processed American food instead of the fresh, nutritious traditional meals she prepared with love and care every morning. The cultural rejection escalated beyond food as I began refusing to speak Chinese at home, claiming I didn't understand when my parents spoke to me in Mandarin, and avoiding anything that marked me as different from my white classmates. If my mother's cooking made me the smelly kid, then maybe my language, my appearance, and my entire Chinese identity made me unacceptable in American spaces. The food shame became a gateway to comprehensive cultural erasure as I tried desperately to distance myself from everything Chinese about myself. The mother-daughter relationship damage was profound as my rejection of her cooking became rejection of her efforts to connect with me through food, her attempts to maintain cultural traditions, and her identity as a Chinese mother raising an American daughter. She would sometimes cry while packing my bland American lunches, knowing that I was ashamed of her and the heritage she represented. Years later, she told me that watching me reject her food felt like watching me reject her love and her entire existence. The extended family meals became torture as I sat at my grandmother's table during Sunday dinners surrounded by traditional Chinese dishes I now found gross because of my white classmates' reactions. I would push food around my plate, refuse to eat dishes I had previously loved, and beg to leave early so I could get McDonald's on the way home. My grandmother, who didn't speak English and couldn't understand why her American granddaughter rejected the foods that had nourished generations of our family, looked at me with sadness and confusion that I was too young to fully process but old enough to feel guilty about. The sensory rejection developed to the point where I couldn't tolerate the smells of Chinese cooking in my own home, the garlic, ginger, fermented black beans, and 5-spice powder that had once been comforting now triggered anxiety and shame because they reminded me of being bullied and ostracized at school. I would open windows, complain about the smell, and sometimes even leave the house when my mother was cooking, creating an impossible situation where the aromas of her cultural identity were literally driving me away from home. The teenage years intensified the cultural disconnection as I actively cultivated a completely Americanized identity, dyeing my hair lighter, wearing colored contacts, dating only white boys, and avoiding other Asian American students who I feared would remind me of the ethnicity I was trying to escape. The food rejection had metastasized into comprehensive identity denial as I tried to become as white as possible to avoid the shame and rejection I had experienced since second grade. The college reckoning began at University of Washington, where I encountered Asian American students who were proud of their heritage, spoke multiple languages, and celebrated rather than hiding their cultural identities. I watched them bring traditional foods to potlucks, speak Chinese with each other, and find community in their shared ethnic background, and I felt crushing regret and loss about the 15 years I had spent rejecting the same heritage they were embracing. I realized that my assimilation had been a survival strategy that had protected me from bullying but also disconnected me from my roots, my family, and my authentic identity. The mother's confession happened during Thanksgiving break of my junior year when my mother finally told me how much my food rejection had hurt her throughout my childhood. She cried as she described waking up at 5 a.m. to prepare traditional lunches I would throw away, watching me reject dishes she had learned from her grandmother, and feeling like she was losing her daughter to American culture that devalued everything Chinese. She had stayed silent because she thought my assimilation was necessary for success in America, but the cost had been our relationship and my connection to her heritage. The cooking lessons that began after that conversation were my attempt to repair the damage and reclaim the cultural identity I had rejected for so long. My mother taught me to make dumplings, stir-fries, braised dishes, and all the foods I had once considered shameful and disgusting. Each recipe came with stories about our family history, memories from our childhood in China, and techniques passed down through generations. Learning to cook became learning to be Chinese again after years of trying to erase that part of myself. The taste rehabilitation was surprisingly difficult because my palate had been trained on bland processed American food for 15 years, and I had to retrain myself to appreciate the complex flavors of traditional Chinese cuisine. The garlic, ginger, and fermented ingredients I had learned to find gross now needed to become delicious again, requiring both physical taste adjustment and psychological work to undo the shame associations that had been created in elementary school and reinforced throughout my adolescence. The social media revelation came when I started posting about my cooking journey and received messages from hundreds of other Asian Americans sharing identical experiences with food shame. Every story followed the same pattern: traditional ethnic lunches mocked by white classmates, parents cooking rejected, cultural disconnection that started with food and expanded to comprehensive identity erasure. The collective experiences validated that my individual trauma was actually part of systematic cultural violence that affected millions of minority children in American schools. The breaking point came when I read research about food-based microaggressions and the long-term psychological impacts of childhood food shaming. Studies showed that being mocked for ethnic food created lasting shame about cultural identity, damaged parent-child relationships, disconnected children from their heritage, and created eating disorders and complicated relationships with food that persisted into adulthood. The research confirmed that what happened in that second-grade cafeteria wasn't just mean kids being kids. It was cultural violence with documented psychological consequences. The therapy that helped me process the accumulated trauma was with Dr. Amy Wong, a Chinese-American psychologist who specialized in treating Asian Americans dealing with cultural identity issues and intergenerational trauma. She helped me understand that food shame was a form of racism that used children's lunches as a weapon to enforce cultural assimilation and punish visible difference, and that my response, rejecting my heritage to avoid bullying, was a survival strategy that had protected me socially but damaged me psychologically and culturally. Food is one of the most intimate expressions of cultural identity, especially in Asian cultures where cooking and sharing meals represent love, connection, and transmission of heritage across generations, Dr. Wong explained during one of our sessions. When children are shamed for their ethnic food, they internalize the message that their culture is disgusting and shameful, that their parents' love expressed through cooking is something to be rejected, and that survival requires erasing everything that marks them as different from white American norms. The psychological damage is profound and lasting. She helped me understand that the food shame I experienced wasn't isolated or unique, but part of a systematic pattern of cultural erasure that American schools and broader society enacted on minority children. The same white children who mocked my dumplings would grow up to eat at Chinese restaurants and claim to love Asian food, revealing that the problem was never the food itself, but the fact that I, as a Chinese person, was eating it and bringing it into white spaces where cultural difference was punished. The grief work involved mourning the 15 years I had lost, the meals I could have shared with my mother, the recipes I could have learned from my grandmother before she passed away, the cultural knowledge and family stories that were transmitted through cooking and eating together, but that I had rejected because white children taught me to be ashamed. Dr. Wong helped me process the anger at the teachers who had validated the bullying rather than addressing it, the school system that had failed to protect me, and the broader society that treated cultural assimilation as necessary and good rather than recognizing it as violence against minority children's identities. The advocacy development began when I started speaking publicly about food shame and its role in cultural erasure, sharing my story with educators, parents, and school administrators who needed to understand how cafeteria bullying about ethnic food wasn't trivial teasing but systematic racism with long-term psychological consequences. I worked with diversity organizations to develop curricula that taught children to appreciate cultural food diversity rather than mocking differences, and trained teachers to intervene effectively when food-based bullying occurred rather than asking minority children to hide their lunches. The family healing process included long conversations with my mother about the pain we had both experienced, her hurt at my rejection, my shame about my heritage, and the cultural disconnection that had damaged our relationship for years. She shared stories about her own experiences with food and identity, including being mocked for her Chinese accent and feeling pressured to serve American food to white neighbors despite taking pride in her traditional cooking. The intergenerational conversation revealed how cultural violence affected both immigrants and their American-born children in different but equally damaging ways. The grandmother's memory became particularly poignant as I learned to cook the dishes she had tried to teach me before she died, realizing too late how much cultural knowledge and family history I had lost by rejecting the foods she prepared with love. My mother would sometimes cry while teaching me her mother's recipes, grieving both her mother's death and the years when I had refused to learn these same dishes because I was ashamed of being Chinese. The community-building work that emerged from my advocacy includes organizing events that celebrate ethnic food diversity and challenge the cultural hierarchies that position white American food as normal while treating ethnic cuisines as exotic, foreign, or inappropriate for school spaces. I work with schools to implement policies that protect students from food-based bullying and educate all children about the cultural significance of diverse cuisines, rather than allowing ignorance and racism to shame minority children about their heritage. The social media activism includes using platforms like Instagram and TikTok to share stories about food shame, post videos of traditional Chinese cooking, and create content that celebrates ethnic food as beautiful and delicious rather than gross or weird. The hashtag #lunchboxshame went viral with thousands of people sharing childhood experiences with food-based cultural erasure, creating visibility for an issue that had been largely ignored despite affecting millions of minority children across generations. The research collaboration with sociologists studying cultural assimilation and childhood experiences of racism helps document the prevalence and impact of food-based discrimination. The data shows that over 60% of Asian American adults report experiencing food shame during childhood, that food-based bullying is one of the most common forms of racism experienced in elementary schools, and that the psychological impacts include cultural disconnection, eating disorders, family relationship damage, and lasting shame about ethnic identity. The intergenerational healing includes bringing my mother to speaking engagements where she can share her perspective as an immigrant parent who watched her daughter reject her cooking and cultural heritage. Her story adds important context about how food rejection represents broader patterns of cultural loss that immigrants fear when raising American-born children, and how schools and society could support cultural maintenance rather than enforcing assimilation through bullying and exclusion. The mentorship relationships I've developed focus on supporting younger Asian Americans who are currently experiencing food shame and need validation that their ethnic food is beautiful and delicious, that their parents' cooking represents love and cultural heritage worth celebrating, and that the problem is racism rather than their food or their identity. I work to help them resist the pressure to assimilate and maintain connection to their cultural roots despite external pressure to conform to white American norms. Today, I work as a food writer and cultural advocate while also teaching cooking classes that focus specifically on helping Asian Americans reconnect with traditional cuisines they may have rejected during childhood. The classes create spaces where people can learn family recipes, share stories about food and identity, and heal from the cultural trauma that started with lunchbox shame in elementary school. The cookbook project I'm developing with my mother includes not just traditional Chinese recipes, but also stories about food, immigration, identity, and the cultural transmission that happens through cooking and eating together. Each recipe is accompanied by narrative about our family history, the role of that dish in Chinese culture, and reflections on how food shame interrupted and then restored our connection to our heritage. Key resources and solutions that made the difference. Professional therapy with culturally competent providers who understand food-based cultural trauma helps process the psychological impacts of childhood food shame and cultural identity erasure. Organizations like the Asian American Psychological Association and cultural heritage organizations provide resources for addressing food-based discrimination and supporting cultural identity development. School-based interventions, including diversity education about food cultures, anti-bullying policies that specifically address food-based harassment, and teacher training about cultural sensitivity in cafeteria settings. Family healing conversations create opportunities for parents and children to discuss the intergenerational impacts of food rejection and work toward cultural reconnection and relationship repair. Cooking classes and cultural education programs help adults reconnect with traditional cuisines they may have rejected during childhood and reclaim cultural heritage that was interrupted by assimilation pressure. Community events celebrating ethnic food diversity challenge cultural hierarchies that position white American food as normal while treating ethnic cuisines as exotic or inappropriate. Social media activism and storytelling create visibility for food-based cultural erasure and build community among people who experienced similar childhood trauma. Research and documentation about food-based discrimination provides evidence of systematic patterns and supports advocacy for policy changes in schools and other institutions. Today, when I meet parents packing traditional ethnic lunches for their children who will face predominantly white school environments, I tell them to prepare their children for possible bullying while also teaching them to be proud of their cultural heritage and to understand that any mockery reflects the bully's ignorance rather than anything wrong with their food or identity. I encourage them to advocate with teachers and administrators for cultural education and anti-bullying policies that protect minority children rather than asking those children to hide their differences. Food is culture, identity, love, and heritage, and protecting children's right to eat their cultural foods without shame is protecting their right to exist as complete humans rather than forcing them to erase themselves to conform to white American norms that position ethnic difference as something shameful rather than beautiful.